I just want to give you a little information before I start the show. I was the daughter of Ormond Capp and Anna Heller. And Anna Heller used to live out on Ann Arbor Saline Road right next to the Grange Hall. So being in Saline, I'm sure all of you know where that is. In fact, her father sold off the land to build the Grange on. So that's the tie to here in Saline. I was raised on a 148-acre dairy farm, which was a working dairy farm until 1995 when my brother sold the cattle. And now he just does the farming there with putting in crops and has beef cattle, but the farm is still there. My dad helped build his own barn. He didn't do it by himself, but he helped, and he used the wood from his woods there, had it cut into lumber and used that. My interest from barns stems from my dad. He loved barns and he loved his farm, and I guess that's where I get it. So that's why I'm here today, to share slides with you. Just in wondering, how many of you were raised on a farm? Can you give me hands? Wow, just about all of you. Okay, and how many here in Saline were raised in, okay, 1 or 2, 3 or 4, okay. How many of you still live on a farm? 1, 2, 2 of you. So we can see how our society's going, right? Everyone's moving away from the farm pretty much, but we still do have farmers, and that's a good thing. So I'm not going to talk to you. I have a lot to say, but I'll do it within the slideshow because it's already getting late for you. So I'm going to start the show, and then if you have questions afterward, we can talk about it.
Do you have your mic turned on?
This is not a mic for this. I guess this is going on some kind of cable TV. So if you can't hear me, I guess you'll have to raise your hand. Okay, so we're not going to be able to see this one very well. It's pretty light. There is one more light back there. Does that go off or not? No, that's emergency light. Okay. Well, that's the Bulges barn. That's out on Plymouth Road, and Bulges Farms was torn down to make way for Red Roof Inn and the Big Boy Restaurant. And that happened in 1968. This, oh boy, this is sad. Very sad. See if it's better. When we looked at it before, it was better over there, but I don't know. This is so light over here. I don't think so.
Which would you rather?
Let's go one more and see if it shows up better. We're getting a little better. We'll try. If the barns are a little bit faded out, you can't see them well. This is the Duverin Farms out on Whitmore Lake Road. And this was also a farm dairy at one time, a creamery. But this is what happens to barns. They're left to decay, and eventually windstorm came along, and that's what happened to that barn. This is another barn on Whitmore Lake Road out in Ann Arbor Township area. And eventually the windstorm came along and took that one down and left it in rubble. This was the Charles Brown farm. He had an elevator, and the story goes that since he had people coming in there all the time with grain, you can see the grain elevators there to the left, he was worried that that barn might cause a problem and fall on somebody. So he decided to have the Ann Arbor Township burn it as an exercise to learn how to deal with fires. Now that is one of the older style barns. It has the gable roof that where the eaves are, the it goes up to a point at the top. That's the oldest style barn made. So here they're beginning to start the fire. It was sort of sad to watch that go down. It gave the fire department some experience, but hard to see a barn go down like that. The stone fence out in the front was built in the 1920s. And that's Mr. Brown himself. This is just a picture along US 23 showing some of the barn art that is put on barns. Some people like to have their barns decorated with chew mail pouch tobacco or whatever. This one had an artist on it. This was the May Mass barn out in Webster Township. She was a painter and she painted pictures on her barns. And I understand this barn is now being refurbished, brought back to life. She died at age 95 or 6 a few years ago. All right, that's not easy to see, but that is the oldest style barn. Again, it has no foundation under it. It's built on some stones at the corners, and it was built in 1897, and it was reported that a railroad worker hung himself in that barn. This was the Otto Weber barn. This barn was on Pontiac Trail and not painted. It was used as a packaging plant by Ann Arbor City, where they packaged leaves for mulching and so on. And they had it repainted in 1988, and then along came a storm on Easter Sunday, a tornado, and took it down. This farm is in Salem Township. It was Watercress Farms on 6 Mile Road. This was a really fancy farm. They had brown Swiss cattle there that they showed and shows. They had 175 head of them, but the older barn that was before this one was struck by lightning and burned. They got their cattle out. But when they rebuilt this barn, Mr. Porath, the owner, said he would never build another barn without having a pond out in front. So in front of this, where you can't see, there was a pond. In case there was a fire, he wanted water there for the fire department to use. Some of you may have known the name Oscar Hearth. He was the manager of that farm for 38 years, and he was a brother of the Hearth dairy brothers that ran the dairy in Ann Arbor. I really apologize for not having these pictures brighter, but nothing I can do. This is an example of another older farm in Ann Arbor Township on Warren Road. It was falling down and being ripped apart by passers-by to use for barnwood in their homes. It was the Walter Kapp farm at one time, but Domino's farm, Tom Monahan bought it, and he turned it into a nice structure once again. He had it painted and all redone, and he called it on the back Watley Farms, which was, he had this Mr. Watley came up from the south to do some planting of gardening. Well, after a couple years it failed, but the barn still stands, and it's still there today. This is a barn in your area on Wagner Road. It's the Lewis Schwarz barn next to the Intermediate School District building in High Point, and they now own that. They've kept it up fairly well as well. This perhaps is the oldest barn in our county. This is in Webster Township. It was owned by, or is owned now by John Alexander. It was definitely the first barn built in Webster Township, and they think maybe the oldest one in the county as well, being built in 1827. It replaced a log barn. It was built entirely on the ground with no foundations at all, no windows. The barn doors are hinged, and you can see the posts leaning against the doors. That was the earliest type of barn doors that were made. That barn is still standing today. This is a Northfield Township barn, actually my great-grandparents' barn. It's now owned by Carl Kempf. And this was built in the late 1800s. Now, from the last barn we saw with no windows, they finally came to building basements in the barn, and they would have a couple windows in them. They have the barn grade that goes up to the second story where they stored the straw and the hay. This is actually the Warren Rentschler farm that you are so well done with saving it and making it useful today. Again, it would be a nice bright picture, but can't see it too well from here. This is a barn that had two angles to it. It was an L-shaped barn. It was getting kind of drab looking. Took 2 years to build that barn in 1883 to 1885, owned by the Kavanaughs on Joy Road. They repainted the barn, and that's how it looks today. It's beautiful. This was the Walter Zeeb barn on Earhart Road. It was built in 1925. Now this is a newer style barn. It's called a Pennsylvania Dutch style with a little peak that juts out the front. It has dormers on the roof line. And after he was going to sell out his farm, he sold it to Tom Monahan, who turned it into this with the white fence around it and really made it look beautiful. But then Tom Monahan had a new idea, and he took the barn and he put it over at their petting farm, which you can't see real well, but there it is at the petting farm, and they call it Domino's Petting Farm on the end of the barn now. So any of you that have gone out that way and visited that farm, you would see it. Here is yet another style of a rounded shaped barn. This is actually a tile barn that's along US 23 Expressway on Jennings Road, but you can see it from the expressway. It's owned by Dr. Griffith's Veterinary Clinic, and they actually use the barn for karate classes. So it's a used barn. This was the barn on my farm where I came from. This is on Nixon Road in Ann Arbor Township. That's the barn my father built. The milk truck in the driveway, probably some of you know Paul Stevenson from the Saline area that hauled milk. He picked up the milk at the farm. That's looking from the south towards the north at the Capp in the roof line there. The farm was bought in 1931, and that's why that's inscribed that way on the roof. This was the Merle Kern farm out in Northfield Township. This is an example of a real typical dairy farm. This barn, I have it over on the table in an earlier year when it only had a gable roof. And when it got closer to the 1900s, he put on what they call a gambrel roof, where you see that the roof line goes up from the eaves and then makes a turn up to the peak, which makes it a little bit more storage up in that haymow. He also added dormers, and he added a new milk house. And that's what most farmers had to do to stay in code with the farming. They had to have their milk houses attached to the barn. It wasn't that way in the earlier days. Whoa. Well, we're not going to get a look at this one, but that's Jerry Dibley's barn. And actually Debbie's out there loading hay or straw, but we can't see that today. This would be the Naylor barn. If some of you have heard of Don L. Naylor Motor Sales, sold Chrysler cars, Plymouth, so on. This is where he was raised. That was on Territorial Road in Northfield Township. Another kind of Pennsylvania Dutch style. This barn was again in Ann Arbor Township. Not many white barns were ever seen, but this one was all white and always was white from the very beginning. This is a Norm Lambarth farm out on Weber Road and Dell Road, right on that corner. And it's again an old barn because of the gable roof ends, you can tell. A tornado also came through there. When was that? A year ago, and took out the end of it. It's now, if you go by there, I see they have a new end in the barn. So he's repaired it. This is Ernest and Jean Gearbaugh's barn, built in 1947 down on Arcona Road in Saline, in your area. And another barn you're familiar with. Anybody know? Somebody should know that one in the Saline area. Ron Weisenreiter, who grows sweet corn and sells a lot of sweet corn in your area. This became a famous barn. It was on the news all the time back a few years ago. This barn was owned by Merle Kern, but what made it famous was the fact that a lady was murdered over across the road in this schoolhouse, which was Sutton's school. She was shot 3 times with a Winchester 12-gauge shotgun in the stomach by John Burns when she was feeding her chickens. And what had happened is she broke off a relationship with him after finding out that he was really married. So when the detectives came to his wife, she didn't know who he really was. She said she had no idea who her husband was. He had his driver's license and Social Security, nothing matched out, nothing checked. So they couldn't find him for a long time because he holed up in that barn right there. And what he did was he went up in the hay mow and he had it all psyched out. He had food stored in there, so he had planned on doing this. He stored his food up there and he put the bales in front of himself so they couldn't see him. The officers searched that barn for days, never could find anything. And while he was in there, he scrawled all kind of messages on the walls of the barn. Well, 17 years later, on that special NBC TV show Unsolved Murders, in the year of 1987, they found this man in Pennsylvania, and his name was Wilford Paul Cashman. He was in Altoona, Pennsylvania. He had escaped in 1946 from a penitentiary in Pennsylvania, serving for 14 years for attempted murder and rape. So our Ann Arbor law officers, the sheriff department actually, went out to Pennsylvania and brought him back for trial, but before they could try him here, he died of a heart attack. So he didn't ever have to go to jail. So that's the story on that barn. This is the Geiger Farm out on 5 Mile in Salem Township, and perhaps some of you knew of the tragedy that happened there when the 2 brothers were killed in the silo from silo gas. Very, very tragic thing to have happen. Whoa. Believe it or not, I don't know what that is. I'm lost. I can't even see it myself. Well, let's go on. We'll see if we can figure it out here. Okay, some of you ought to know that one. Anybody recognize that? That was the, yeah, I hear the name. Somebody said it. John Solochek barn on Ann Arbor Saline Road. And in that place now, that's been ripped down on a golf course near Ellsworth Road. This is the Brookwater Farms. This is in Webster Township, owned by Don Zeeb, who was supervisor up there for a while in Webster Township. This is actually the carriage house. This had 10 horse stalls, and it was made out of bricks that were actually made there on the farm at the time. Also on that same farm is this barn, which was a barn built by Luther Boyden in 1830. So now this is still an old barn, but not the newest barn, because we talked about that John Alexander barn that was in 1827. Anyway, church meetings were held here, and it was sort of interesting because this Mr. Boyden wanted to build this barn, but he had to get people come in from the surrounding area of about 12 miles around. Otherwise, he wouldn't get enough help to raise the barn. But the township had put in a temperance society at that time where they couldn't serve alcohol. Well, most of these farmers wanted to drink alcohol when they came and did something like that. So it was a little bit tricky for him not to have the alcohol to serve. So anyway, he invited these farmers to come and help build this barn, and he said, but they would not be served any whiskey. So when he was told that he would fail on this project, he said, well, then fail it is, we're going to do it. So March 25th of that year, they had the barn raising. And when they came, it turned out to be a success because he fed them a big, big barn raising supper. So the men were okay with that, and they didn't have a problem. So he got his barn built and without any whiskey. And they actually had church in this barn at the time. They had no church in Webster Township. This is the stately house that goes along with that. Still there today. This is another barn over in Northfield Township that you can just see the original barn at the left behind that silo. You can see the outline, but he added on to it about 3 or 4 times. To the right was a barn he added on for pigs, and then he added on a barn to the left, and so several additions to that barn. And the house that goes with that barn also was a brick house and was made from those bricks that were made over on the Brookwater Farm. This happened in around 1910. This is a picture of an 8-sided house, which is over on 8 Mile Road, and it was interesting because there aren't many 8-sided houses around. This farm was purchased in 1856. The barn I never got a picture of because it was burned by an arsonist, and it would have been over 150 years old by now, but sad to know that that had happened. This barn is down by the Broadway Bridges in Ann Arbor, owned by the city of Ann Arbor. And at the time when this was a working barn, Raymond Cook, who used to be the Washtenaw County Road Commissioner, not at this time, but when he was a boy, he remembers delivering hay to this barn with horses with his dad. And then what they did was they hauled coke around the city of Ann Arbor from that barn. This is the Rokel Farm out in Northfield Township, John Rokel Farm. And this barn, the frame of the barn, they got from down on the corner of 7 Mile and Farmington Road. And so they took the team of horses down to get it in a wagon, and his dad followed him with the Model A car. And he left at 5:30 in the morning, and he never got home until 9:30 at night with the barn frame on the wagon. So the barn that he got this from, the barn frame, was located where Sears and Roebuck is today down there on Farmington Road. The barn measured 64 by 30, and he took the rest of the lumber and the siding and stuff from their farm woods. Then they added an addition, which you can just barely see, if I can point that out to you. Over to the left-hand side, which is right there, there's another addition. They put on 41 more feet to make it a total length of 105 feet. So the farm was bought in 1913, so this year this farm is going to be 100 years old. The house was built in 1909. The electricity came through this area in 1928, so that gives you a little idea. This barn was the barn down on a Saline barn. Let me see. Well, can't find my card. This was the Neel Bonett barn down on Jordan Road in Saline. Some of you may know that barn. This is actually barns from my grandfather's farm. The barn in the foreground is the horse barn, and in the back is the dairy barn. And here, this shows a repainted barn in 1989. The barn was built in 1911. This barn was on the corner of Pleasant Lake and Zeeb Road, was the Ermine Finkbinder barn. I don't know if he still owns that or not. Maybe the son does now? Yeah. And this barn is Don Feldkamp's barn out on Moon Road. And that was an original barn built by Fred and Sophia Hertler Kleinschmidt. And he's actually the brother of the guy that built the barn out in Northfield Township that had the brick house that we talked about. This barn was built in 1911. It was pegged with no nails. But being built in 1911, it has the expanded roof style, the Gambrel Roof style. So it had more hay storage. It had 4 horse stalls and 8 cow stanchions in there at the time. And as I came into Saline today, this is the Irwin Frederick barn, I saw that they're doing work or have done work on that barn. I was really surprised. This barn was featured on the plat book cover of 1997 for the area. This was Liz and Mark Conrad farm out on Tufel Road in Manchester. And the reason I took this picture was because all of those roofs on the barn and so on were slate roofs, and you do not see those slate roofs today. So that's quite a unique barn. And a slate roof never wears out. This is on Ellsworth Road. This is Milton and Janet Wiedmeyer's farm. And again, I apologize. This barn does not show up well. This is the Ken Stegginga farm on Goodwich Road in Saline. This is how it was when they got it, and then they repainted it, and at least that one shows up a little better. And I just talked about the Stegginga's barn. Their daughter, his father lived here, and also Deb is here today. This is Ken Zeeb's farm out on Earhart Road in our area, Northfield Township. He's got his tractors out there if we could just see them. That barn was built around 1900 as well. This is a falling down barn here that we can't see very well. This barn was the Elmer Grove barn on Pleasant Lake Road that was moved from its place down the road to another, I believe it was a doctor that bought it, and it was done by the Steggingas. They had bought this place. So I'm just going to take you on a little tour. They moved it through the cornfield, hooked onto a truck, and got out onto the road. It was an interesting day. And they put it in a spot where it was going to actually live its next life. I don't remember the doctor's name. Trimble? Trimper? Okay. And they built a foundation underneath it, and I've not gotten back to get the final picture on it, but I think they have sporting events in it. Some beautiful barn now, yeah. They've redone it all. This is the Elmer Wessel farm out on Dixboro Road, called West Elm Farm. That's what's on the corner of that building. This is in snow time. This is a picture of it as you go along the road. It's a little bit brighter picture. The wood here for the barn again was taken from the farm and used on the barns. Well, we're going to near the end of the show here. We're hoping to get blossom soon, right? It's spring. Those were beautiful. And I think when we see our landscape, we're apt to see lots of silos that stand alone, because there's no way to get rid of the silo unless you blow it up with dynamite. So we don't have the barn anymore, but that silo stands out on DeVaren Road. Most barns being built today are metal, like this one, because it's changed today. We don't do as much hay storage. We don't need the hay mows, so now they build pole barns, metal pole barns. But if you still like barns, you have your dad or your grandpa build you a play barn. And that is going to end my show for today. But what I would like to do is read you a couple things before I close. I would like to read you the recipe for a barn raising, what they serve. 115 lemon pies, 500 donuts, 15 large cakes, 3 gallons of applesauce, 3 gallons of rice pudding, 3 gallons of cornstarch pudding, 16 chickens, 3 hams, 50 pounds of roast beef, 300 light rolls, 16 loaves of bread, pickled red beets and eggs, cucumber pickles, 5-gallon stone jar of white potatoes, and a 5-gallon stone jar of sweet potatoes. So wouldn't you like to be cooking all that? And then I have one poem that I'd like to read about Grandpa's old barn stands high on a hill. Through weathered and old, it's sturdy still. It creaks and it groans while bracing the wind. And just like Grandpa, it's a faithful friend. It shares my secrets of an earlier year and memories of youth that I still hold dear. Memories again remain of when I played oft in the fragrant hay piled high in the loft. Newborn calves frisk about in their stall with nary a care or a worry at all. A litter of kittens with fur soft as silk incessantly begged for a treat of warm milk. A cozy haven from the cold and the rain, my grandpa's barn I remember again. For a romp in the hay without a care or a darn, I'll return up the hill to Grandpa's old barn. And that was by Charles Clevenger of New Boston, Ohio.